Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It's July the 2nd, 2021. It's late morning in San Francisco on the west coast of the United States. I hope you're all well. We're preparing for July 4th. Actually, to be honest, I'm not really preparing for July 4th, but most Americans are, to celebrate their independence. And yet, in the midst of all this, COVID continues to, I don't know if it's fester, but certainly make the headlines. Lots of updates on the vaccine, whether it's effective, whether it's ineffective, whether it protects us against new kinds of versions of COVID. Questions in the New York Times about whether Joseph Biden, the current president, is declaring independence from the virus too soon. Of course, there's both the politics and the science of declaring independence, particularly a couple of days before July 4th. Meanwhile, it seems as if the pandemic, this has become a word that we all accept. I'm not exactly sure whether that's the right word to describe COVID. Whether certainly COVID has resulted in us changing everything about our lives, about how we work, about how we don't work. Headline in the Times about retiring early. And above all else, I think rethinking the very nature of health. My guest today on the show is a quite remarkable man, actually, in many ways, not just as a scientist, but in terms of his remarkable life. His name is Peter Sterling. He's the author of many things. He's a distinguished professor at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a long-time political activist. His last book is called What is Health? And he is honored. We are honored that he's talking to us from Massachusetts. Peter, what has COVID taught you? Are there new lessons that you hadn't thought of before this so-called pandemic? I don't know whether you think that's the right word to describe the COVID.
Well, I think it's a pretty good description. I'd say when it first started, I and a number of my friends went back to Camus' The Plague. And if you read that, written, I guess, in the late 40s, about a plague year in Algeria, it sounded pretty familiar. So, yes, I think it was a big deal. And I think one of the things that actually Tim Jackson in his new book brings out is that it stopped
post-growth. We had Jackson on the show, and actually Tim Jackson was generous enough to introduce me to Peter. So there is a connection. His new book, Tim Jackson, we talked to him last month, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism.
Yeah, so I just finished that, and it's a wonderful book, and I think it clarifies that the pandemic stopped the world capitalism in its tracks, and guess what? We can do without it. So I thought that was one lesson for me. The pandemic has enabled me to speak to many people about the ideas in my book that I wouldn't have been able to. I could teach a course at the University of Pennsylvania, living in Massachusetts now. I could give lectures from Panama, where I live part of the year. And without, all I have to do is get out of bed and open my computer. So it's Zoom has been a big deal, I think, for everybody.
Peter, you have, and we'll get to this in a little bit more detail later in our conversation. You have a long history. I don't think it's any secret. You're 80 years old. You were born into a communist family or communist sympathizers, and it's shaped your life on lots of levels. Has COVID confirmed the teachings of your parents, of the party, of the idea of capitalism being profoundly flawed?
Well, I'm not sure that we needed that lesson. I think what I'm more interested in right now is that that the country seems to be opening up a bit. I think what the lesson that was taught was less by COVID, but George Floyd. I think the
Right.
shock of George Floyd and the fact that we now have videos, smartphone videos of all of these acts that have been going on for centuries is a big deal, and that's really what's opened things up right now. I probably wouldn't be talking to you if it wasn't for George Floyd.
This is the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, which, of course, resulted in much of the civil rights success of the civil rights movement, or the beginnings of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. You were a young man, Peter, a student at Cornell, and you were brave enough, some people might say crazy enough, certainly committed enough to be part of that first wave of freedom riders. Before you talk about that and we celebrate the 60th anniversary, is there a connection? Is it coincidental that the year of COVID is also the year of Black Lives Matter? You seem to suggest that it isn't.
Oh, I don't know. If somebody likes that idea, I guess I could go along with it. But I think it's really I think it's the shock of all these shootings that were going on, and in the context of the Trump administration and the kind of life that he brought us. And I think there's a struggle really between this serious racist administration and the filming of George Floyd that has really shocked a lot of people and made them ready to pay attention. I mean, for example, when I proposed to teach a course about my book, which is it's a very basic science book, but it shows the way from molecules up to social problems. I proposed to teach this at the University of Pennsylvania to graduate students in neuroscience. And the director of the program said, "Oh, yes, great, I'll take it. Moreover, we'll call it Neuroscience, Health, and Social Justice." This is not a course title that would ever have been proposed or permitted over the decades that I was teaching. Now it's possible.
Well, you're one of the figures, Peter, I think, who's breaking down the boundaries between the hard sciences like neuroscience and the social sciences, history of racism and injustice. You had a very interesting piece in Time earlier this year entitled "How Neuroscience Could Explain the Rise of Addictions, Heart Disease, and Diabetes in 21st Century America." All these diseases, of course, are very much, as you suggest in your work, rooted in social injustice. What does neuroscience tell us about the way in which disease afflicts certain groups, particularly underprivileged groups, more than the privileged?
Yeah, well, that is the key question, and that's really what my book is about. So when I began studying first as an undergraduate, and I continued on at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Medicine, the idea of the body was health is just something that the body is regulated independently of the brain. So the idea is if you had some rise in blood glucose, that your pancreas would automatically secrete insulin and cause a reduction in glucose. And so the body was completely self-regulating. And of course, that was true of blood pressure as well. So if you had high blood pressure, people sort of wondered, well, how do you get that? Why is that? Must have something to do with with eating too much salt or bad genes. And of course, Black people suffer much more and much higher high blood pressure. And people say, well, we don't really understand that. There's something defective about them. And I began to look at this in the early 70s with a man named Joseph Ayer, as a follow-up to my experience working in the ghetto, where I saw people who had strokes from hypertension. And I found evidence, neural evidence, that nerve fibers from the brain contact all the blood vessels. They contact the heart. They contact the kidney that raises blood pressure. And so it seemed to me clear that social tension really has neural pathways to cause hypertension. And that's really the message that I've been preaching in a way and working to elucidate since about 1975.
Peter, we had Angus Deaton, who I know you know, the Nobel Prize winning Princeton University sociologist, on the show. And you write a lot about Deaton and his wife, Anne Case's work on the flaws in capitalism and the injustices. Are you on the same page as Deaton when it comes to these new diseases rampaging the poor of America, particularly the opioid crisis?
Absolutely. I use his data extensively in my book. I reprint his graphs and I show them when I give lectures. And the National Academy of Sciences actually has a new report out that came in March. It's a 475-page report. And it documents in detail the statistics that Deaton was reporting earlier. And they sort of scratched their heads. Well, Deaton called it deaths of despair. I don't know. We really have to study what do we mean by despair. I've written a critique of this, which I'm hoping will be published soon, saying, suicide is a very good measure of despair. We don't need further study about this. And so the official scientific establishment is still sort of wondering what the problem is, where it's pretty clear what the problem is that not only is there structural racism and overt racism, but the basic supports that people need to get through the life cycle. They need prenatal care, they need maternal care, they need child care, preschool, they need decent jobs and health care. And when there's no prospect of this, people lose hope and they decide to, that they really don't want to live. And that's really the issue that we face now. And I think Deaton and Ann Case have done a fantastic job in documenting this.
And they, of course, won the Nobel Prize for that work. In your timepiece, you write, the conditions of human life began to improve with the Enlightenment of the 18th century. And you suggest we are in many ways better off. But then you go on, it hasn't been an unbroken line of advancements. In the last 3 decades, US death rates have risen steeply from suicide and compulsive consumption of alcohol and drugs. And then you talk about Case and Deaton. Is this affecting whites now more than African Americans? Is it a white problem as opposed to a black problem historically?
Well, it's affecting everybody. The black community of younger ages had been for a long time improving because they started at death rates that were like tenfold. A young black man die at, I don't know, five or more fold higher mortality rates than whites. But their lives over the last 20, 30 years has been gradually improving. And moreover, younger people had the feeling that they would do better than their parents. The white people, particularly those with no education beyond high school or even less, they now have the prospect of doing worse than their parents. And so their despair has been rising sharply. Moreover, the death rates used to be high in the city and low in the country, but now the countryside has been sort of become so desolate that the highest rates of despair and deaths from despair are in the countryside. So the white rates still of males still don't exceed the black rates, but they're rising very steeply, and that's where the deaths of despair have been rising sharpest.
Peter, when I see a worm in the dirt, I generally don't think I'm related, but In your timepiece, you suggest that we have much to learn from worms. You write, our ancestor 500 million years ago was a marine worm equipped with a brain. And you go on to explain that this worm operated on dopamine, the same, I guess, the same drugs that we operate on. Is there a very clear lineage between that worm 500 million years ago and us humans today?
Well, yeah, this is a subject of many scientific studies. It's not a direct link, but yes, once worms appeared, they had a brain, and one of the reasons they had a brain is before that they had a clock, a biological clock, which would tell them what time of was day and what was night, and how to switch their biochemical metabolism from day to night and to operate efficiently. And the worms needed a way; they needed signals to find food. So there's a circuit that tells you to seek food, seek water, seek warmth, seek mates, seek friends, and companions. And the worm does this. And when the worm finds one thing or the other of these things, it gets a little drop of this chemical dopamine. It's not a drug; it's actually a fundamental neurotransmitter, and that allows the seeking to pause briefly. And we experience this pulse of dopamine as a moment of relief. You can sort of catch your breath and relax for a minute before the circuit says, well, you got food, but you need some water, or it's pretty chilly. You better get a sweater or find a warm place. And you go on to the next need. And each time you find it without really expecting it, you get a little pulse. So that has been driving us since we were worms. Of course, we could trace our way back from being hominids to primates that were simpler, monkeys, back to primitive mammals, and so on, all the way back to fish, back into the water. And in each case, we split off from some earlier ancestor, but our very early ancestor was definitely some sort of worm. Yes,
I get it on the worm front, Keith. Peter, not Keith. But what about on the empathy front? You had an interesting piece in Scientific American entitled "COVID-19 and the Harsh Reality of Empathy Distribution." Can we explain empathy in biological, evolutionary terms? Or are some of us simply more empathetic than others, or are some of us simply better than others when it comes to being sympathetic to other people?
Well, I think it's both. All of our traits of various kinds. I mean, empathy. My point was empathy is a particular trait, and some people have a lot of it, and some people.
Yeah, you said it comes from genetics. You said empathy has a substantial genetic contribution, about half as much as height. A group of researchers found in 2018. And I'm wondering whether you feel you inherited empathy, because you are a very distinguished scientist, Peter, but also a political activist. As I said, 60 years ago, you were bravely involved in the freedom marches. You risked your life. Did you inherit empathy? Do we inherit it? Or are some people simply wired to be more empathetic than others, irrespective of where they come from?
Yeah, well, this is exactly my point, that we are wired for these things, and the wiring starts out as partly it's generated by genes that are turning on and off at the right time, and so you have a propensity to do something. When you do something for which you find rewarding, for example, being praised for a behavior by your parents, rewarded by praise, you tend to repeat it. And so you gradually learn it, and then it strengthens. So if you have a little propensity for empathy in your intrinsic circuits, and you practice it because you get praise for it, it gets stronger and stronger. If you have, because of your genetic inheritance, very little natural empathy, and your parents who gave you those genes don't have much either, then you don't get rewarded for it, and you become progressively less empathic. And I think, uh, I think
So
I
that speaks of the importance of the family, Peter.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think, my family was, my father in particular, was extremely empathic, and he tutored me in this, and he persistently encouraged me to behave empathically. And so this is part of my values, I would say. Uh, so the people who are clearly non-empathic, such as our former president, uh, he didn't get that from his father, and he didn't have much to begin with, and so he's probably as strong an example of very little empathy as we could find.
It's interesting, Peter, that you write about your involvement in the freedom rides in association with current biology. Um, you write that what's happening today in America is good turmoil, and in this piece you have photos of bus burnings and a narrative about the violence that you experienced on the journey down from the north to Alabama. Um, what do you most remember about the freedom rides now, 60 years later?
Oh well, that's a interesting question. 50 years, 10 years ago, there was the 50th anniversary, and many of the original freedom riders converged on Jackson, Mississippi, where we had been jailed, and it was good to see everybody. I got to meet some people I hadn't known, reunite with some people I had joined, and I realized when I came back, I read a whole book on the history of the freedom rides. And what I learned from that book, and also from the NPR, the PBS series film on the freedom rides, it's a 2-hour film, was that the freedom rides were really carefully planned ahead of time as a test to see if the federal government would enforce desegregation on interstate travel, and clearly they weren't doing it. And so the freedom rides sort of all of a sudden developed as a massive test of this right. And at that time, with the Kennedys, where it was 1961, Jack and Bobby Kennedy were, I wouldn't say they were real. They tried to persuade the freedom riders to stop, but they
And
also
indeed, Tim Jackson, in his post-growth book, as you know, the narrative is built around uh, Kennedy, Robert
right. That's
Jack
right.
Kennedy.
That's right. But his narrative starts in 1968, and
Yeah.
I discussed that with him. In 1961, Bobby Kennedy was not ready for this, and but he was worried about the bad publicity, international publicity. So he tried to hold us back, but it was unstoppable. So I think what I took from this PBS uh, film, which is really terrific, it's still available, is that the grown-ups, we were foot soldiers. I was 20, and there were foot soldiers, and we were carrying out the larger, wise, well-financed plans of civil rights workers, leaders, such as were CORE was one, Congress on Racial Equality, the NAACP, and so on. They had figured out this was the time to move, and they had a bunch of students, young people, who were ready to go. And so that's what I take in retrospect, is that it needed bodies, but it needed a great deal of planning and thought ahead of time.
You're a little too self-effacing, Peter. I think you're not willing to take any credit. The credit that you give in your piece is the significance of the United States Communist Party, and you suggest that they learned the courage and the principles. Do we need to relearn that, the history of American communism? Is it something that, of course, these people were persecuted throughout the 1940s and 50s, perhaps even the 60s and even today? Um, are there principles that your parents and perhaps you learned that generally Americans can learn? Yesterday we had and again, an interesting book that you might look at by the University of Michigan historian of antiquity, David Potter, on disruption, why things change, in which he says we have much to learn from Lenin and Bolshevism in terms of the injustices of today. Are there things that we need to go back to if we're to make sense of today's disruption and the injustices and inequalities of capitalism?
Well, I'm not a historian. I did grow up on some of these things, and I would say that I grew up with reading Karl Marx, and Marx and Lenin's Communist Manifesto, and it's a short document. You can get it on the internet, and this is the origin of the idea that from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And this is an attitude toward the world. You try to give to people, provide for people who need something but are not quite as able, perhaps. And I feel that I was given quite a lot of ability. I was given a certain amount of courage, and so I feel.
So even your courage, you feel, is inherited. Well, is there any reason to reward yourself? I mean, everyone has agency, Peter. Not just you can't just you just can't blame everything on genetics, can you?
No, it's genetics and my parents. Look, the article in Current Biology.
You have brothers and sisters. Did you have brothers and sisters, or do you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, my sister is deeply engaged as well. She's a leader in gender, the rights of genders, of all genders. She wrote a famous article called "The Five Sexes," that's widely quoted. But I think it wasn't just the genes. My parents were struggling the whole time and were, suffered a certain amount of threat to their own lives from this. I reprint in this Current Biology journal the cross that was burned on my parents' lawn in June 1961. And that was because my mother helped a Black family who were friends of hers rent a house in an apartment in a white garden condo. And so we got the lesson from their behavior and from dinner table conversations every night. And so one of the things that I realized that's wrong with Karl Marx, is that he wrote about he believed that there were laws of human history and that it would be inevitable that we would end up with communism. And I think I've come to see that as a mistake. Marx did not read Darwin, and he didn't really fully accept that we are just a species of animal. And if you accept that we are a species of animal descended from a worm, then you have to abandon the idea that there are laws of history. We don't know where history is going.
Has anyone fused the two traditions, Peter, of Marxism and Darwinism?
Well, this is what I am trying to do. Yeah.
Are they compatible? Can they be fused, or are they so foreign to one another?
No, I think Marx's passion was to create a society where people would contribute according to their ability and help people according to their need. I mean, that was his spiritual attitude. Okay, and I think he was a spiritual man in that sense, and so I think that spirit is very compatible with Darwin. But we just have to keep in mind that we are animals, and we have to understand that. The point about empathy is we're not the only empathic animal. If you have a rat and it sees another rat that's trapped in a cage, and there's a lever that the first rat can press that releases his brother rat or sister rat. He'll do it, and he'll go to a lot of trouble to do it. So
Right.
animals.
So Sherry Turkle reminds us of that in her empathy diaries. We had the English, I guess, social theorists, Nicola Rehani, on the show recently. She has a new book out, The Social Instinct, How Cooperation Shaped the World. She is also, I guess, a Darwinian thinker. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Rehani's work, but I assume you share her scientific reading of cooperation when it comes to our species.
Yes, definitely. Also, my colleague Michael Platt, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, Joseph Henrich, who's at Harvard in social.
Right, and Joe Henrich has actually been on the show too,
Yeah,
talking about
yeah, no,
his weird book, his
yeah,
weirdest book.
that's right. And he has another earlier one, which is great, called "The Secret of Our Success." No, I am very much in that spirit.
But there is agency, Peter, isn't there? Let's end on the issue of human agency, which, of course, was Marx's one of his great contributions, is the role of human agency. I'm not quite sure he was the determinist that some people have suggested. We had Sarah Horowitz on the show recently. Like you, a woman who is from a family of labor organizers. She writes in her new book, Mutualism, about the need to organize on the labor front. Marx, of course, was above all else a theorist of work and of class and of the way in which technology can liberate us. Are you encouraged, Peter, by the promise of artificial technology in terms of liberating us from the drudgery of work? Marx seemed to think that industrial technology would liberate us. It didn't. Can digital liberate us and finally free us from our enslavement to capitalism?
No, I don't think so. I think it's taking us down the road to a climate or a climatological Armageddon. No, I think we have all the stuff we need. We just have to consume less. We have to work less. We have to relax more. I mean, the community I live in Panama is a rural community where people grow their crops with a hoe and a shovel, and they live pretty happily. They're not in despair. They're not dying with suicide and drugs overdose. We live in a community where there are no police, for example. People just behave reasonably, and they have a spiritual life. So I'm not. I mean, of course, I've benefited scientifically from all of this technology, but I have a garden now, and I think that people could do a lot better by stepping back. I'm not saying abandon technology, but certainly stepping back from it. And
well, in this sense, you're very much on the same page or image as Jackson, his post-growth life after capitalism, or his other book, Prosperity Without Growth. And
right,
finally, Peter, you end your timepiece suggesting that actually, going back to 1941, I've never heard this argument before. It's an interesting one. After 1941, after the 5 days after Pearl Harbor, rationing was introduced into America, rationing of transportation goods and foods. You say that actually wouldn't be such a bad thing. Maybe we need to go back to rationing.
yeah, I'm not an economist, but it seems to make sense to me. I mean, if everybody had a certain number of air miles they could spend each year, and they could trade them, we could reduce, air travel. All of the things that we need to do to get the climate back on track, we need to do right away. I mean, we're really in trouble.
Well, one thing I would not suggest rationing on are books, and Peter Sterling's new book, or relatively new book, I think it was out last year, What is Health? Allostasis and the Evolution of Human Design is a really interesting read for, I think, more the scientifically inclined us, but he has an enormously important contribution across the field in political activism, in thinking about the environment, thinking about empathy, thinking about disease. Peter, in these strange times, I know you're still in Massachusetts. Half the year you live there, half the year you live in Panama. What else should people be reading in addition to your book to become wise like you?
Well, look, I would say, although part of that book has some technical part to it, you seem to have done very well with it, and I would say that determined readers can do pretty well with it. So
absolutely, I'm definitely not discouraging people. People need to read it. It's an important book, and it's I think it's a Princeton University book publication.
MIT.
Sorry, MIT. Wait.
Yeah.
That was a mistake. Well, that's not chopped liver either, Peter. That's quite an accomplishment. So, yeah, people need to read your book. What else should people be reading, though?
Well, again, I'd say the most profound book that I have read in the last 10 or 15 years is Darwin's Origin of Species. And even though I'm a biologist, I never read it until about 10 years ago. I thought, oh, it'll be dry, it'll be dull. I know this, I know that already. But in fact, it's so brilliantly reasoned and so wonderfully stated. It's a tremendous piece of work, and he just comes across as this tremendous human being. And at the end, I wrote an earlier book with a colleague, Simon Laughlin, called Principles of Neural Design. And at the end, he said, we have to write a summary of this book. I said, well, no, we're tired. We don't need a summary. And so, but he insisted. So I went back and I read Darwin's summary at the end of this Origin of Species. And it's so inspiring to read his overview of the arguments he's made and how he understands it. And he's just a calm, deeply thoughtful man. And I don't think you could, and wonderful writing, I don't think you could do better than that.
Well, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, one of the two most influential books of the 19th century, with Marx's Communist Manifesto, or Capital, perhaps. Peter Sterling, a guy who not only is a follower of Darwin, but also in some ways of Marx, someone committed to combining them. Congratulations, Peter, on a remarkable series of works, on your book, on your articles, on your commitment to political justice. I hope we'll have you back on the show again, because I think your voice is a really important one. Thank you so much. Keep well. And maybe next time we can talk to you from Panama and you can show us your garden there. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. I've enjoyed this a lot. Great. See you soon.